Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Woodburn Accountants and Advisors webinar series on tapping into China's trade opportunity through traditional, retail, and e-trade. You have joined us for part 3, day 3 of this webinar series, where we will be looking at China customs clearance procedures. How can I clear my goods through customs in China? Are you trading with China? Have your goods been stopped at customs in China? Have you been asked to settle crazy import duty and VAT charges before goods are released into China? Do you know how the actual customs procedures work in China? So today, we will hopefully be answering all of these questions, and I'm very happy to have 2 guest speakers on from the Landers Group, Kevin Rogers and Alan Chow, who will be presenting on this topic. But before we begin today's session, again, there's always a couple of new faces that pop into each of the webinars. I would just like to know a little bit about who you are, okay? So usually my webinars are geared at 3 groups of people. The first group is the newbies to China. So those of you that are looking for an opportunity in China, have found an opportunity, but you're evaluating it, or you're in the process of already putting pen to paper and creating a strategy and business plan, and you're just trying to educate yourself a little bit more on doing things right. If you're a newbie, please type it into the chat box. We're going to have an extremely interactive Q&A at the end of today's session, and if you're not interactive with Kevin, Alan, and myself, this is probably not the most opportune time for you to be joining. Use this 60 to 70 minutes really to get all the clarifications you need, but interact with us. Let us know a little bit about who you are. So if you're a newbie, do let us know. If you are a startup in China, this is how I usually categorize startups. These are companies that have been established in China for a period of 1 to 3, 1 to 5 years. And the main focus of attention has been predominantly on the core business functions, sales, merchandising, supply chain, etc. And a lot of compliance and administrative procedures and efficiency and optimization techniques have been sort of forgotten or never implemented. So I do know that I've had startups on here who've been looking to go back into the administration and compliance side. If you are one of those startups, again, let us know. It gives us a little bit of background about who you are. If you are an experienced China hand, we also want to know this. So do let us know, have you been in China for 15, 20 years? I have a lot of experienced China hands who join these webinar sessions predominantly to get new and fresh ideas and more information and education on how things actually function in China. I'm happy to have everyone on here, but just let us know who you actually are. And I see some people are starting up. Lee is a startup, Philippa is a startup, Steve is a newbie. That's fantastic. So I think that gives Ellen as a startup, so it gives Kevin and Alan a bit of an idea of how to direct this presentation, because there are a lot of newbies and newly started up companies in China. Magdalena is a startup. So, Kevin, Alan, I hope that gives you a bit of a direction for today's presentation. We really appreciate that interaction, everyone. So how this webinar works, we're not here to sell you, we're here to educate you. So the whole idea about these presentations this week is to educate you on how things work when you're trading with China. And today's main topic will be educating you on customs procedures. And what we want is that during the Q&A, which is usually the most fun part of the presentation or the webinar, ask us questions, make comments, share your experiences and that show where you have a little bit of doubt, because this gives everybody a perspective that everyone's kind of in the same boat. But it also, you've got 2 experts on here today who can help you in terms of gaining knowledge and understanding how you can do things a little bit better. We can't go into intricacies and details and case-by-case studies, but at least you'll have a couple of answers to your questions, and you can always go into further details with both Kevin and Alan or myself. So please use the next 60 to 70 minutes really as a valuable spend of your time. A little bit of technical stuff, because I'm in a technical issue right now myself. My Wi-Fi is a bit weak today. So that is on my side. I'm going to do my best to make sure I stay online for the next 60 to 70 minutes. So far, everything's looking good, and I'm using my landline to get on through my audio. The recording is going to be here today. I'm not exiting. I have asked Kevin and Alan to also not exit. So I just want to highlight, we won't be exiting. If I have a Wi-Fi breakout or if they have a Wi-Fi breakout, we will be coming on to finish this presentation. I promise you that. But if you have difficulties on your side, it's very difficult for me being on this webinar and trying to monitor and moderate everything to help you. I don't own GoToWebinar, so there are technical guidelines, but just remember, we're recording this. It's going to be up on the YouTube channel, and you'll get a copy, hopefully with Alan and Kevin's permission, of the presentation as well. So a little bit about myself. So those of you that didn't join Monday and Tuesday's webinar sessions, who am I? This is a picture to give kind of a voice to the face to the voice. My name is Christina Kohler-Coluccia. I am the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. I have been in China since the end of 2003, so I'm almost hitting up on 17 years being in Shanghai. My core expertise and experience is in corporate compliance and administration in China. So my focus is 100% on inbound investments, helping foreign investors with building up their business models, implementing those business models, and then hopefully getting to a next milestone of growth and focusing on that growth. The key issue is making sure you get all of your operational experiences in order that you have the ability to focus on that growth. So again, customs is always a question mark for everybody. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about warehousing, which, I mean, I can tell you case studies in both situations of that clients have experienced. So I'm going to leave that to Kevin and Alan to talk about it. I'm also a creator of the China Roadmap Method, which is helping foreign investors to get on the right journey to eliminate as many obstacles as possible when going into the Chinese market and then actually implementing their models and growing. So if you're interested to learn more about that, I've got a webinar coming up on July 7th. I can't insert the link, it's a bit complicated, but if you're interested in joining, at the end of today's session, I'll give you my WeChat ID, my email, and I'll just send you the link if you want to join that session, all right? So I'm going to let Kevin and Alan speak. I'm going to unmute them both. Kevin, you're unmuted. Alan, I'm trying to unmute you. It's not working. Can you maybe click on the red microphone yourself?
Yep.
There we go.
Perfect.
Alan? Super.
Okay, thank you, Christina. Shall we start?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for the introduction, Christina, and it's a pleasure to be a part of the webinar today. Yeah, so just an introduction. I'll take my part first, and I'll ask Alan to explain himself. So I've worked for Elanders Group since 1999 and fulfilled various roles from manufacturing through to general management, and now a member of the group management team globally. I've got global responsibility for sales and marketing across the world. I spent most of my early working life in the UK. I then gained some experience in the Czech Republic, and last summer I returned back from a 4-year posting in China, which was a very interesting experience and a very steep learning curve in terms of understanding how things work in China from every perspective, but especially from a supply chain. So Alan, I can hand over to you.
Okay, so hi everyone. So this is Alan here. I have been working with Mentor Media since 2016 and also specializing providing end-to-end supply chains also into various roles, key account management, program management to a lot of international clients. Before I joined Mentor Media, I was working in various roles within different industries such as Christian Dior, as you can see on the screen, also Pfizer in the pharmaceutical paste industries, with different role and responsibilities. That it's in relation to sales and key account management.
Perfect. Thank you, Alan.
Yep.
So
No
just to explain a little bit about Elanders, this is by no way a sales pitch. This is part of the education and knowledge sharing that we're going to do today. So Elanders is a Swedish-owned global supply chain and print and packaging business. Our global turnover is just over 1 billion euros. We've got a presence in 20 countries, and we've got 90 facilities which are wholly owned by Elanders, and approximately 1 million square meters of warehouse and production space, and circa 7,000 employees. That fluctuates a little bit during peak periods. And the next screen just shows you a snapshot of the locations where we have operations. So we cover everything from Asia through Europe and the Americas. And on the next screen, it gives you a good indication of the Asia market. And what does jump off the page here is how significant the China market is as one of the key markets for Elanders Group, which we can come back to. The next slide just explains what we do for our customers and how we support them, and that is through end-to-end supply chain solutions. So I won't go into this in too much detail, but it basically starts at the point of origin, manufacture of the goods, all the way through to final distribution and even managing return logistics. But a key point of this is obviously the customs topic, which we're going to be covering in detail today. So just to introduce the customs procedure content, and on the next slide, it just explains a little bit about the structure of Elanders, and part of the group is a wholly owned subsidiary called Mentor Media, where Alan works, and Mentor Media is our Asia headquartered supply chain business. So Mentor designs and implements comprehensive supply chain services, and it's very much customized and tailored to each client's requirements, because every client has a different requirement. And we're very much a trusted partner for some of the world's leading companies and leading brands from an end-to-end supply chain perspective. So that gives you a basic understanding of who we are. Without further ado, I will hand over to my colleague Alan, who was on the ground in Shanghai, who can explain in detail the China customs clearance procedures.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. So today we're going to go through some of the key topics that it's in related to the China customs clearance procedure, and how does it work physically. So some of the topics that are covering including importation, exportation, overseas goods to China free trade zone, and the overseas goods to the China domestics, and in reverse from free trade facilities to overseas destinations, and also some of the paperwork that requires for clearance, and a simplified customs clearance process. And having furthermore, we have what issues that can occur during custom clearance and what are the solutions, and some of the experience that I'm going to share with you, and some of the issues that we tackled in the past. Moving on, we have the tariffs, VAT, tax explained, and also some of the special certifications required, and some of the restricted commodities that you guys should be aware of if you are importing or exporting goods in or out of China. Okay, so the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to start with the process applicable to air and sea freight. So this is the process we are going to talk about for overseas goods to the China free trade facilities. When the brand owners are sending the shipments to China free trade facilities, the step ones are the documentations that we are required. As you can see on the screen, some of the documentation such as commercial invoice, packing list, and contract, optional. So commercial invoice, I will not go into detail. Some of the crucial content that we need to include, such as the unit price, the quantities, the bill to and the ship to, and consignee's address, etc. So some of the information that needs to be on there. And as for packing list, it will be a detailed explanations of the product that you're going to ship to China, and such as its dimensions, times and weight, and for example, if it's palletized or not, and the HS code, some of the information that has to be there in the list. Optional is the contract, purchase orders, and sales orders. Those are optionals. It depends if the China Customs would like to see it or not. And those information needs to be provided from the shipper side. And under the step 2, we have the bill of lading. So this is very important when you ship, when you're using various transportation modes to ship from overseas countries to China, free trade facilities. The bill of lading, if you go by air, this is, those both documents are compulsory, whether it's by air or sea. And for example, for the air bill of lading document, it needs to be provided to the consignee before the same, or to your forwarder before this same day of departure. And the documents needs to be provided for the ocean freight. It's going to be provided to the whoever's doing the clearance, needs to be provided before the ship sails from the overseas destinations. And moving on to step 3, we have need to provide, once we have all the documents above, we are going to perform the customs declarations, and the lead time is going to be in the usual 2 to 3 working days. And this is subject to when we receive all the above documentations in full. So we have to make sure that the above documentations are received before that who's the parties is doing the declaration work with the China Customs. And after that, we are going to the step 4 in final to arrange the physical goods from the port to FTC facility. This is assuming that the shipment is close to arrive the destination port. So this is when, after the clearance, customs has released the shipment and it's a green light, then we have to arrange it physically from the port to deliver to the warehouse. And the step 5 in optional below is to, some of the documentations are specifically required by the China Customs. In the event if your products are under a certain criteria, such as if you have any wooden products or any raw material products that require specific certifications to prove to the customs that this is legit and this is qualified to deliver to the China mainland. And for example, like if you have products that contains battery and or any electronic gadgets products, then you will need the proof of 3C certificates. So this is to prove that your items are not hazardous or not dangerous, and it's proof of manufacturing from the overseas supplier. And if you have any raw materials products, that you will need to prove any provide a certification of non-hazardous document to the China Customs. And on the remark side, if your product HS code are categorized under the AB, so this AB, it's a code name that's defined by the China Customs that under this criteria, AB categories, certain products will be inspected. For example, some of the AB category will including food, including beverages, or some of the agricultural products, and some of the raw material products, or special texture products, such as, for example, if you importing endangered species, leather, skin, or pythons, or some of the raw material products, those are required to do immediate inspections with the China Customs before the goods can physically bring into the free trade facility. And some of you may or may not know the free trade zone. So free trade zone is viewed just like overseas countries like Singapore. If you can view free trade zone like Singapore, like Japan, it's a free port, and hence all the overseas products that's coming into the China free trade areas does not require any taxation to be paid. So you can consider as if you're shipping a product from USA to Japan, and before it's entering to the Japan mainland, it's not going to pay any duty and VAT. So only when the goods are required to import from the free trade facility to China domestic market, then the taxations are required to be paid. And having mentioned as a remark, under the step 5, if the step 5 is required under the product that you're going to ship to China, you have to ensure that you complete under the step 3 and step 5 before you do the physical arrangement or the green light by customs that can allow you to bring from the port to your free trade facilities. Okay, so the next one. So the next slide, we're going to talk about the overseas goods to China domestics. So this is when, assuming when the goods are residing in the free trade facilities or the goods are still residing overseas and it's going to ship direct to the China mainland. And under the step 1, those are the compulsory documentations that we need to do, such as a commercial invoice, packing list, and contract. So contract in this stage, purchase orders, sales orders in this stage are compulsory. This is because China customs are required to see a legal documentations between the buyer and the seller, or whoever is the consignee party. They need to see a valid contract that there is a legal agreement between the transportation and between the delivery of the goods from overseas destination to China. And this is our information that required. Under the step 2, so this is the bill of lading. So the bill of lading are also compulsory and applicable to air freight and sea freight. And the air freight are going to be provided on the same day of departure. And for the ocean freight, it's going to be provided before the ship sails. And those are usually, such documentation are usually can be provided by the brand owner, by the shipper, or any appointed service provider from the brand owner. And moving forward, we have, once we gather all the documentations above, we're going to perform the customs declarations for import. So this section, we're talking about importations. It's a bit more, the steps are required compared to delivered to the free trade zone. It require more steps because this is a direct importation from the overseas to China market to any domestic facilities that you're going to ship, or to a consignee address, or to a person's house, or to a B2B locations. And once we perform under the step 3, we perform the custom declarations. We need to pay the VATs and import duties to the China customs. And this is the compulsory steps because every time if you import any products to China, those are the requirements that needs to be done beforehand, and also needs to be done before China customs giving the green light for you to physically bring the goods from the port to the domestic market. So in terms of the VATs and duty paid, as you can see on the below note, we have an example of the calculations, how to calculate for the import duty and VAT. If we take, for example, over here, I have the product, a canteen, for example. If we to ship 5,000 units, and under the CIF value, which is the cost, insurance, and freight, if we assume it's $15,000, and the HS code under the canteen product category is going to be 8% for the duties, and the customs handbook under the HS code is the 13% for the import VAT. So the 13% import VAT is a set percentage by the China government, and this percentage can be adjusted depends on the regulations set by the government. So in the past couple of years, I recall the percentage of the import VAT is 17%, and then it deducted to 16%, and now it's 13%. And the HS code, 8%, is depending on your product HS code. Different HS code have different percentage that you needed to be paid under the China Customs Handbook. For example, if you can look at the calculations, those are, for example, the 3,306, those are the amounts that needs to be paid if you import a 5,000 units of a canteen product. And having said that, in the event, if the products that you are importing into China market, and if your products are under certain categories that requires specific certifications, and if it's required, then we'll have to do the step 6 to provide the necessary documentations to China Customs before we bringing the physical goods to the destinations in China market. So the first step is going to be providing all the documents and doing the custom declarations and pay the VATs and duties. And the lead times I also mentioned, if you can see on the screen, some of them are 2 to 3 working days, some are the roughly 1 to 2 working days, depending on the clearance speed, and the lead times are not including the public holidays. And step 6 is usually longer because the optional step is usually you have to provide in additional documents that is requested by the customs. So it may depend on how quickly you can gather those documents and submit it to the customs all in one go. Then the quicker you can clear everything and deliver it to the destinations in the China market. Okay, so
Alan,
if we go to the next slide. Hello?
Alan,
Yep.
sorry, just to help maybe the people
Yes.
who won't be able to join the webinar tomorrow, because I know you'll be covering the different warehouse options then. But just to explain the key difference between the free trade zone customs and the domestic customs is that once they clear customs to be in the domestic environment, that's where the VAT and duty is compulsory. So for the free trade zone warehouse, you can use that as an export hub for, say, the APAC region. And because they're sitting in the free trade zone, then there's no VAT and import duty to pay unless you clear China domestic customs. Just to help the guys understand that, maybe the ones who won't join the meeting tomorrow.
Yep. Thank you, Kevin.
Cheers, Alan.
No problem. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. So the next slide, it's going to be talk about the free trade zone from free trade facility to overseas destinations. So this is when the crucial point. People may wonder, if I have a supplier in China, if I wanted to export out from China to other countries, how do I get the VAT and how do I get a tax rebate? So this is the process that explained under the point that if your suppliers are located or manufactured in China, and if you want to export your products out, and this is the steps that you can get your tax rebate in between. So follow from the step 1, compulsory documents such as commercial invoice, packing list, those are need to provide to the service provider or to the brand owners, whoever is doing the clearance work. Also after that, once we have the documents, we can perform the declaration for export. So this is a standard of 2 to 3 working days. And once, depending on when we receive the documentations above, then we can perform the official declarations. It's very simple. After the step 2, customs giving the green light for export and the declaration is a green light, then we can deliver the outbound goods from the free trade zone facilities to the port. And usually for the ocean freight, we have to deliver the shipments from the free trade facilities to the port before 2 days before the departure. This is because the port operators requires all the container load to be loaded before the ship departs 2 days in advance. And also for air shipments, we have to deliver the same day because usually the air freight, it's going to be the same day delivered, same day departure, or even the next day departure, we have to deliver the shipment on the same day. This is to deliver once the clear declaration is approved by the China Customs. And having said that, if the supplier wants to get a tax rebate, before we provide the step 1, the supplier can actually get the tax rebate in advance when they deliver the shipments to a free trade facilities. So this is the benefit of free trade facilities, which I'll explain into the next into tomorrow's sessions. And for you guys, if you are interested into the warehousing options, so this is just to give you a little hint, suppliers can get the tax rebates when they deliver the good to the free trade area in advance. And following to the step 4, so this is the additional requirements, and this is we need to release the bill of ladings when it comes to exportations, whether it's going by the ocean freight mode or air freight. So some of the documentation that we need to provide to the consignee or to the receiver, those are the documentations, the bill of lading we need to provide to the brand owners to oversee consignee or customers. And under the step 5, this is an optional step. This is, as I mentioned, following the previous step. If your products consist of special materials or special requirements that needs to provide the specific certifications, and then you have to apply in advance before the goods are allowed to export from the free trade facilities. And bear in mind that under the below notes, under the step 2, we have to make sure there are circumstances that the China Customs may perform random inspections. So many people are wondering, how does my goods going to get inspected, or how does it work if I get inspected? So I'll explain in the further steps in a couple next pages to explain further. But people are wondering, how does the inspection work? Like, does it work every time? Does my goods will get inspected every time? So this is depend on, we call it the random lottery pick. So the China Customs may request various shipments or certain shipments to be inspected. If your shipping goods are under specific materials that require to provide specific documentations, then the inspections rate may be higher. And if you're shipping a normal consumer items that does not require any optional certifications that require to provide to customs, then the goods are usually giving as a green light to export. And there are only circumstances that the chance that the customs may inspect your goods, it's by the random pick in the system. So everything through the China Customs, it's all system linkage. So what China Customs will do is they will pick whatever the shipments that is going out to any destinations. They will do a lottery pick, and whichever the shipments got picked, then the loads, the shipments during that batch may get inspected by the China Customs at that time. And having mentioned in the event, if under the step 5 is required, then we have to complete step 2 first and then move to step 5 before we can complete the delivery to the outbound goods from the free trade facility to the port. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. So the next slide will be explaining some of the important documentations that required for goods into clearance. For example, I just put as an example of a food product, fruit. So if we to do the fruit products to do export out of China, some of the documentations that I listed on the left-hand side in the presentations, those are the documentations that may or may not required. And for example, we need to provide the bill of lading, the packing list, commercial invoice. The customs invoice are generated usually by the service provider that you appointed, and the insurance policies are referring to the freight insurance policy. So this is the documentations that the customs may or may not require to see. It depends on if they wanted to they wanted to ask you which forwarder that you are appointed to do the delivery of the shipment, then they may require to see such documents. And the HS code list, so the HS code documents, so this is the documentations that require to provide the customs to prove that this HS code is legally registered, whether it's from your overseas desk, from your overseas side, or from the China free trade facility area that's been registered into the system with China Customs. And import quota certificate. So this is a certifications that required by the China Customs to validate that what kind of import, what kind of VATs that you needed to pay if you wanted to do importations. So those documents that are listed on the left are applicable to import and export. So some may require, some may not, but these are all the documents that you need to note before you're doing any importation or exportation. You need to prepare it on hand. Okay, so if we move to the next one. So the next slide is explaining a simplified customs process. So some of you may find it quite funny because you may find that I've never seen such a simple declaration process before. It's always so complicated. But this is a very interesting slide that I wanted to show to you guys, that how in general processes that is going to work when you're doing the declaration for whether it's for importation, for exportation. This is a simplified custom processes for import-export. And for example, some of the steps which I mentioned above, those are covered. And so some of the documentation that you needed to provide, such as the pro forma invoice, packing list, bill of ladings, and the HS code documentations, and the proof of certain certificate if your products are under certain categories that is listed in the custom handbook. And for example, some of the documentations and the invoices that you need to provide beforehand before you do the declaration work. And the suppliers need to you have to settle all the payments before the goods are going to handle or delivered to the destinations. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. So this slide is going to be, I'll give you some of the cases that we previously handled in the past. So some of the issues that can occur, some of the common cases. So for example, have anyone facing any importation, exportations of consumptive materials? So we had a case in the past, whereas we have to do importation or exportation of wooden materials, that including the wooden pallets. So in China, the regulation stated that any importation, export of wooden materials has to be monitored by the customs strictly. This is because to ensure the materials that you're handling, whether it's going to be import or export, it's not going to be harm to the society or to whoever you are delivered to the destinations, or if there's any infectious from the material itself or any dangerous materials that are going to be harm to the to any publicities or to any organizations. So that's why those materials are monitored by the customs very stringent way. And we have to make sure that if there's any materials that we import that consist of wooden pallets or wooden materials, we have to make sure the necessary documentation proof to ensure that those material is accepted for import export. For example, we had a case where in the past, whereas we had a shipment that is coming from US, and under the documentation it stated that the product it's a laptop. So the laptop, we assume that the documentations is going to be stated just laptop only. But when we received the physical shipments, when we received it on the announcement at the port in China, we found out that the documentations does not include any information regarding the pallet. And in physically, when the customs are doing the inspection, they found out that the pallets, that the products are actually palletized, and the wooden pallets are not described in the documentation that's provided customs. So having said that, we faced the situation whereas we have sent a ground team to the customs office in the free trade facilities to explain the situation to the China customs and say, hey, we have to, this is the batch of shipments that we received from US, and those are included in the wooden pallets, and here is the documentations that prove that this is wooden pallets and is fumigated, or this is treated pallets, and make sure that this is not harmed to any of the organization or to the receiver or to any public or to delivery address that we're going to deliver. And having said that, we have to give the face-to-face meetings with the China Customs to explain the goods and also to hand over the documentations that prove that the materials with the products are not harmed. So after that, it took us a couple, like 3 to 4 days to hand over the documentations, and everything was giving the green light by the customs. Usually the customs are very strict in the way they wanted to. There's a reason, because they wanted to protect the organizations in the whether it's in the free trade area or in the domestic China market, to make sure that the goods are received it's all in one piece, and make sure that the goods that you declared are exactly what you mentioned in the documents. So we have to make sure that whenever you're doing any importation or exportations, we have to make sure that the list of the products, every single product that is going to be in the shipment, or any items that are going to be in the shipment, has to be clearly listed on the documentations, whether it's going to be in the packing list or whether it's going to be in the commercial invoice. So for example, if you have the shipments that including, for example, you're shipping your laptops, then you're going to be palletized the shipments, then you have to make sure that the palletization, the pallets informations are included in the packing list, or additional spreadsheets that explaining that the pallets are treated or they are not harmed. Or that also apply to any other cases, whereas if you have any value-added services that is inside the shipments, you have to make sure that you explain to the customs within your documentation provide. You have to explain that, hey, this shipment including what kind of material inside, including what kind of packaging inside, retail packagings, or even just a brown box packagings, supplier manufacturing packagings inside. So those need to be listed very clearly to the China Customs, so that they can give out the green light for the shipments. Okay, so if we get to the next slide. So the next slide, I'm going to talk about the tariffs, VATs, and duties. So some of you may not know how to calculate the VAT and duty, and wondering, so if I wanted to import a product, what are the duties, or what are the criteria, or the amount that I needed to be considered, or I need to pay in order to bring in the goods successfully from overseas destination to China market? So if as all commodities that is going to be importing into China, we need to pay the 3 types of tariffs. So the listed below, we have customs duties, or so-called import duties, and consumption tax. So the consumption tax are depending on if you have any consumptions duties that it's defined by the China Customs, whether it's by a percentage rate that is listed in the customs handbook. So it's in relation to your HS code. Different HS code may have different consumption tax. And the value added tax, which is the VAT. So the VAT is usually depending on the customs. So it's also set by the China government. So currently the VAT in China is 13%. As I mentioned in the past, we have facing the VAT, which is incredibly high, from 18% to 17%. Now it's been decreased to 13% for all the commodities. And for the import duties, and this is where it's defined by the HS code, and different HS code has different import duties. For example, as I mentioned in my previous case studies, I have the canteens. Under the canteen, HS code is going to be 8% in the custom handbooks. So I may need to pay the 8% import duties whenever how many units I wanted to import to China market.
And Alan,
So,
could you?
Yep.
Alan, could you also cover the cross-border e-commerce situation?
Yes.
In terms of
Yeah. So as I mentioned, this page is explaining about the generic tariffs, VAT, and taxes under general trade. So some of you may have wondered, how does it work for an e-commerce cross-border trade for importation? So the cross-border trade importation will depend on, first of all, the customs will look at your HS code. So if your HS code, because under the cross-border e-commerce, the regulation is set differently compared to the general trade. So the cross-border e-commerce will have a different custom handbook for your HS code if you're doing any importation from the free trade facility to domestic market. For example, in my past experience, we have handled a consumer items of, for example, like books, accessories. The HS code are set in the cross-border e-commerce as 6%, and compared to a normal general trade is going to be 9%. So the reason we use the reason customs has the different HS code in the cross-border e-commerce compared to general trade is because the e-commerce are usually purchased by the consumer direct. So whereas the general trade is usually purchased from the business to business scale. That's why there's a different trade, different HS code and different tariffs that needs to be paid. So for the consumer's perspective, because the China government wants to promote the for the publicities for customers, individual customers to purchase the goods from overseas. So they wanted to promote. That's why they want you to buy more on either through online, offline, or to a website. So they want to encourage the tax that you're paying. It's going to be decreased compared to if you're shipping the goods under a normal trade as a batch of shipment.
And it's fair to say, Alan, on cross-border e-commerce, the customs clearance procedure is very simple because a lot of that is managed through the cross-border e-commerce transaction with the marketplaces.
Yes, indeed.
So,
and within the and the efficiency of the cross-border e-commerce is faster because it's a B2C rotations. So the government wants to promote how to clear the goods in a very fast way so that anybody who's purchasing the goods online can receive it within the next day or within the same day delivery when the goods are residing in the free trade facilities. And compared to a general trade, because it's a bulk shipment, so the clearance may take a little bit longer, and usually the amount will be bigger. So that's why the customs will look into very details when you're shipping a bulk shipment under a B2B scale. So hence the tariffs, VAT, and tax are going to pay differently, and the procedures may do it in the different ways. Okay. So if we go to the next slide, which is the further explanations under the tariffs, VATs, and tax. So the China customs duties for import commodities. So under the custom handbooks, there are so many items that are taxed, nearly 9,000 items. Any consumer items, electronics, gadgets, or any commodity that you can think of are usually taxed under the China customs handbook. The only thing they are not taxed is the items that are usually beneficial to the China government in a political way, or usually benefit to the societies, or emergency items for the societies. Those are usually untaxed. But if it's something that is consumable, or usually this is a requirement that is going to be purchased from a consumer basis or even from a business to business scale, the items are usually taxed. Or if it's a transaction items, those are usually being taxed by the China customs. And under the China duty rates on import goods consist of the general duties, the most favored nation duties. I'm not going to go into detail of each items. Those are specifically or optionally required by the customs if certain rates need to be paid upon VATs and tariffs. And the consumption tax, usually it's imposed on the companies and organizations who have manufacture or import taxable products, or even process any taxable products on their consignments, or sell taxable products to any other buyers, whether it's overseas or in China mainland.
And Alan, just one thing on the consumption tax, it's a good point to just highlight that in a cross-border e-commerce environment, if there is any consumption tax, then the consumer has to pay that themselves.
Yes.
That isn't the responsibility of the brand owner or the store owner on the marketplace.
Yep. So usually when you are purchasing any items online, usually a consumption tax is going to be bared by the consumer itself. For example, if you buy anything on eBay, Amazon, even the Tmall platform in China, some of the consumption tax are varied. So you have to pay when you are purchasing the product. Some of the consumption tax are already inclusive under the price that you purchase online. Some of them are exclusive. So it's depending on between which online shop that you're purchased from. So it's all varied from different buy to purchase. Yeah. Okay. So under the next slide, so as I mentioned, under the VATs and tax and tariffs, so before under the old rate, it's 17% in the past they have to pay for the VAT, and now the new rate since 2019 it's 13%. So the China government are actually giving benefit to, whether it's on the B2B scale, they're giving the benefit for whoever is doing the importation from overseas. Then the percentage that you're paying for the VAT is lower. They wanted to encourage a lot of overseas goods and selling it to China market to promote for the branded customers. And under the old rates, for example, the transportation services, sales, lease, and owning of immovable properties, those are the taxes that apply for 10% in the past. Now it's 9% under the VAT and sales. And for the financial services, for example, other services that's doing any VAT has to pay for the VAT. If you're having engaging business in the financial space, modern services, or any transactions, or if you are service providers or consulting services, then the usual transactions that your VAT needs to be paid is 6%. So for example, if you are doing not importation or not within the supply chain business, if you're doing any financial businesses or any consulting firms businesses, or even in the logistics firms, any services engaged between two parties in China, then you have to pay to the government under the service tax of 6%. So there are different taxations that needs to be paid depending on what kind of services that you engage between the two parties. If you usually engage buy sell, then it's usually 13%. And if you're engaging any other transportation services or any immovable property, telecommunications, or construction services, those are under the new rate of 9%. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. So the next slide are an explanations under the certain certifications are required specifically for the listed products that if you can see in the presentation. So there are certain products like gadgets, electrical wires, cables, or even the welding machines. For example, any lighting accessories. Some of the equipment that accessories or products that inside those categories are required for CCC certifications. So CCC stands for China Compulsory Certification. So this is a certificate that is required by the China government and China Customs to prove that it's a compulsory requirement that the China Customs wants to see this certification to prove that your products are legally proved to do any import and export processes. So we had a previous case that in the past that we are handling for toys for customers. Then under the toys, there's a battery product inside the toys. For example, whether it's under soft toys or a harsh soft toys that including the battery functions, then we have to apply the CCC certification. And many of you may wonder, or many of you may experience the certification required, and how do I apply? So this is under the criteria when the CCC certification is usually applied by your manufacturer. So this is a very easy application that can be submitted from the manufacturer to the local authorities, to apply for the certification to prove that the products that they manufactured are qualified for import-export and qualified to sell in the China market, for instance. and whether your product is manufactured in China or your manufacturer is residing overseas. And those are the certifications that can be easily applied in their own origins. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. So having said that, those are the page that is going to be talk about some of the prohibited, restricted commodities that the China customs may will have to put a very, I would say, very strict focus on in terms of doing any import and exportation work, or any goods that's coming to China in and out. Those are the products that the China customs may view it very strictly before giving any granted access for any import in and out or exportations. So, for example, like animal skins, as I mentioned earlier, some of the prohibited materials such as leather, such as unique leathers, python skins, or crocodile leathers. So those are the animal skins that they are prohibited. Some of you are into manufacturing business or into the specific requirements of prohibited animal skins. If you wanted to import, export out of China, then China customs may have to view under your HS code, and you may have to provide specific documentations to prove that your material is unharmed, or your material import export is legal to do any import export work. And some of the antiques or some of the prohibited animal, I would say so. The three fundamental products that are not allowed to do any businesses in China is, one is going to be weapons. Secondly, it's going to be drugs, illegal drugs. And the third, it's to do with anything that's toxic products that can harm the organization or societies. Those are the three prohibited items that cannot be doing any business of import and exportations in and out of China. And I think this may happen not just China. I think this may apply in any of the countries worldwide. And some of the restricted commodities that we will dealing the customs that will deal in a very strict way. So, for example, ivory, jewelries, furs, gambling devices, or even raw materials, metals, stones, or even steel products, and any kind of like medical drugs that you manufacture. If you want to do import export, those are the documentations that we have to make sure that if you are involving in certain criteria inside the presentations, just have to make sure that you follow the China customs website to make sure that the documentation that you have to provide in additionally, in order the customs can give you green light to do any businesses, import exportations in China. So as I mentioned previously, some of the steps that you need to do for declaration work. So this is the criteria that if your products are under such categories inside this slide, you have to make sure that before you do any declaration work, you have to provide additional documentations to prove that you are legal to do any importation of your products in and out of China before you do any official declarations. And further on to the next slide. So some of you may wanted to have the detailed step-by-step processes, documentation. So this can be available upon request. You may contact me further on. Later on, we'll have my contact details in below. And for now, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Kevin, for conclusion before we move on to the Q&A webinars.
Perfect. Thanks, Alan. Very good. Could we just cover some topics just for the audience? So in terms of China, obviously it's a very large country, and there are multiple ports and entry points for import and export. Is the process the same at each port, or do they vary?
So it actually varies. So as you may know, some of you may not know, China is a very big country. So there are so many ports, whether it's that's residing in, for example, if I take Shanghai as example, Shanghai has two major ports. One is in close to the Ningbo area. So Ningbo port is the very traditional, the first established port in China. And follow on in Shanghai, we have the Yangsan free trade port. So two different ports will definitely have different operation models, and will have different clearance procedures, may or may not in additionally. So the previous presentation slide that I mentioned is the fundamental processes that is required and can be applied for different ports residing in the different locations in China. But there are certain circumstances that China Customs may require in specific port for whoever is the service provider. The customs in that port may require them to submit additional documentations in advance prior to different ports. Yeah.
So okay, so the process is essentially the same. There may just be requests for additional information, but the key steps are, as you listed on the previous screens, to get all of the paperwork correct and so on. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And okay, and if there are any issues, if goods are withheld at China Customs, you know, what are the steps to take to get them moving?
So there are several scenarios when the goods are stuck with customs. So the most common scenarios that we have faced in the past is whereas the documentations are not submitted correctly. That's the most common cases we face. So we have to make sure that, as I mentioned in the previous slides, the documentations inside the content, we have to make sure that we submit it clearly to the China Customs, and make sure that it's if you are submitted, the documentation has to make sure that it's both English and Chinese version. But if your products are manufactured in China, of course, the customs will accept it's going to be a local language documentation. But if your shipments are coming from overseas, then the documentation has to be origin, has to be in English. And sometimes the China Customs may not require you to do any translation of the documents. So sometimes we have to make sure that the documentation keep not just the original paperwork, but also a translation copy for the origin to the China Customs. And so, for example, if your goods are stuck in the customs, what are steps that you need to do? So first of all, we have to make sure that we contact any of the ground teams that your appointed service provider is residing in. So for example, if you're providing a door-to-door service from the overseas goods to deliver to the destination, you have to make sure that your service provider has a ground team in China to contact with, because assuming they're going to be the one that's going to get the first alert by the China Customs that the goods going to be stuck by there. So we have to make sure that the ground team over there is going to have a face-to-face meeting with the China Customs to understand what the issues, why it's being stuck in over there. Is there any lack of documentations that needs to be provided, or if there's any shipments that is not qualified to do any importations or to do any exportation work over there, or if the shipments are not palletized or are not done in the way that accepted by the China Customs. So certain scenario, China Customs may require you to have a ground team to have a face-to-face communications, or even through phone calls to explain the situations before they give in a green light for you to clear the goods.
So from the brand owner's perspective, the paperwork is absolutely vital. Getting that correct, so it matches the commercial details and also the product description. That's essential. And if there are any issues, then having I guess a local partner, trusted partner on the ground to support you with any direct dealings with China Customs is a big advantage.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Okay, I think they were the key things that I just wanted to make sure we shared and help with educating the guys on the webinar today. So absolutely, the presentation is available for sharing. I guess, Christina, you will help us manage that from any interested parties who would like a copy of the presentation.
Yes, I will. I'll be doing that.
Perfect. So Alan's contact details, my contact details, and also Alan's general manager is also there on the PPT. So any of you guys can reach out to us after the webinar if you have any specific cases you'd like to discuss. So handing back to you, Christina.
Thanks. So there are questions that have come on from people in the audience today that I just want to go through, because that is what we promised them at the beginning. So there's a question from Kim asking, what about if semi-finished goods are imported, such as electric cables, that are then assembled onto equipment that will then be exported? How is customs duty and VAT applied? Can it be imported without duty and VAT?
So if it's a semi products that's been manufactured or being kitted, so usually the China customs will need to see the structure of your products, how it's being kit, and it will depend on what other HS code that you wanted to define with the China customs. So this is where the steps that if you have any semi-constructed products or any kitted products from the raw material to a finished items, so usually the finished item will have a defined HS code from the China Customs Handbook, and this is something that the information can also be found in the China government customs website. They have an English version of the custom handbooks for all the semi products, and also if you are not sure whether what kind of VAT percentage or duties that I need to be paid for, if it's under importation or export, we would recommend to reach out to the China customs to make sure that the HS code, we can have the HS code that you can think of in the custom handbook and do a submission to the China customs, and China customs will do an evaluation of your structure of the products and the submission of your preliminary HS code, and do an evaluation to give you a final HS code for export.
Kim, I hope that helps. There's another question from Mika, but I think it's already been answered. Mika was asking if you could get all the specific documents and certificates related to importing food and beverage items. But Mika, there's a whole slide listing all the bullet points of documents that are needed, and also how to define the HS code for food and beverage items. So I think you can refer to that slide. If you have any other further questions on that, feel free to reach out to Kevin or Alan in that regard. Emra had a question in regards to the VAT calculation. So I think I'm going to go back to that slide. Otherwise, it's going to be a bit difficult probably to explain what his question was. Hold on, let me go back. It was the slide very early on with the certificates. Here we go. So Emra's question is, when you look at the calculation where it says 15,000 times 0.08, he was asking, what is that 0.08 and why is it calculated twice? Because you have in the next brackets plus 8%. So he's wanting a little bit more detail on how that formula is calculated.
Yep. So allow me to explain this. So the 8% is the HS code that is going to be defined in the your customs handbook. So the HS code rate is going to be 8%, and usually we have to times from the CIF value, which is the cost plus insurance and freight. So for example, if your cost that you wanted to declare to the customs is $10,000, and your freight, insurance and freight is going to be $5,000, then this is the CIF value in total. So the reason why there's a 2 is because usually the 8%, so 0.08 is going to be the HS code, and the 8% is actually the insurance and freight. The 8% over there is actually going to be the insurance and freight consumptions altogether. So for example, $15,000 times 0.08 plus $15,000 plus 8%. So this 8% is inclusive of the insurance and freight. Some of the percentage over there, the China customs take into considerations. And sometimes the $15,000 plus the 8% may or may not apply depending on the customs regulations under the handbook. And after the calculations from the CIF value, we have to time the 0.13. So the 13 is the 13%, which any kind of importation of a products that is required to pay. So this is called the 13% will be called the VAT. So the VAT in the past, it's from 70%, 17%. Now it's been deducted to 13% for majority of the commodities. Yeah, that who's doing any buy-sell services, manufacturing services, or any trading services.
Thanks, Alan. Emma, I hope that was answering your question. Then there was a question from Mark.
Also, oh, sorry, Christina. And I think if they have additional questions regarding the calculations, I can also share. Christina, I can also share after the sessions. I will share. If I have any questions, I can also do a simple calculation for them. If they have any question, they can reach out to me and Kevin.
I think you, for specific details, they can reach out directly to you, Alan. I think that's no problem.
Yeah, no problem.
Martin had a question. If we intend to get from our Chinese entity the below certificates, is that all we need if we need to import, export from China? The certificates he highlighted was the registration form for the filing of foreign trade operators, e-port registration, and the customs registration certificate. Martin, I think your question is more referring to whether your own entity in China can do import or export themselves. Is that what you're referring to? Versus outsourcing it to a logistics provider? Maybe you could clarify that in the question section before we answer it. Martin had a question. Are there any specific requirements needed for the importation and export of medicines in and out of China? I think Alan answered that it's in the prohibited and restricted sector. So it's important to do comprehensive research to know whether you would be allowed to do that and what documentation you would need to submit in order to be able to do that. Mika had a question. If I may, I would like to ask the second question. Are there any benefits to importing the goods to Hong Kong first and then from Hong Kong to mainland China?
So the explanation, as I mentioned earlier, the benefit, I would not call if there's any benefit to import to Hong Kong first and then to China. I will also saying that China has already established so many free trade areas that it's just within the China mainland that it's having the similar functionalities as Hong Kong or as any other global free port destination like Singapore, Japan, or even Malaysia, for example. So there are nowadays China government are trying to promote a lot of free trade areas for the benefit of anybody who's doing importations from overseas to China mainland. So having said that, routing from Hong Kong and routing to the China free trade area, there's no difference, because if judging from the cost perspective, if you to do routing from Hong Kong and then going to China, you'll be having additional transportation lead time and cost from my perspective. But if you are doing, if you just go straight to the China free trade facilities or any free trade area in China, then you can avoid the cost that's routing from the Hong Kong areas, because China governments are established many free trade areas to allow a lot of overseas brand owners to import their products origins to China mainland to promote their products in the China market and to sell and to do any trading or to do any buy-sell services in between.
I think the short answer, Alan, is that there isn't really any major benefit now, especially as you've explained, China have set up the free trade zones to behave in the same way.
Yep.
I think ultimately it also comes down to what is your long-term vision for your structure in APAC, because if you joined yesterday's webinar, you would have seen a business model structure where Hong Kong is included, but it's solely utilized for trade with APAC, which means you may want to have inventory stocked in Hong Kong for the APAC region, and then other inventory going directly to mainland China. So it really comes down to what's your vision and what you're planning on doing.
That's.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Sorry, Christina. Go on.
And TOSA is going on the same direction. It's funny, those two are right after each other. With an e-commerce commodity to China, would one have to have a base in Hong Kong?
That would be sold through cross-border e-commerce, would it?
That's all the question. Yes, my assumption. So in TOSA, if you're directly selling through cross-border e-commerce to a consumer in China, it would go directly to the consumer that's based in China. If it's going to a consumer in Hong Kong, it would go directly to a consumer in Hong Kong. It doesn't go via Hong Kong. I'm not sure if we answered your question on that, but.
Yeah, okay. So for consumer cross-border activity to the mainland China, you can serve that from the China Free Trade Zone warehouse, if I understand the question correctly.
Right. The next question is from Tobias, who's asking, how about software? Like software as a service, so software can be considered a good or it can be also considered a service, but there's nothing traded physically. It's actually, most of my clients that do software, it's you download it through email or you download it through the cloud system. Is there a customs process on selling software into mainland China?
So for example, if you're selling services in China, software services, then it's categorized as a service provider, and any kind of service provider, the customs will be viewing the VAT is going to be 6%. So any transaction is done between the two parties for any software and related, the VAT needs to be paid is going to be 6%. It's not going to be any other commodities, a physical product, for example, like canteen is going to be 8%, or books is going to be 9%. So it's a different VAT needs to be paid. So any kind of service related fees, for example, if you're doing any other service, if you're a service provider or software provider, those are categorized as the VAT under the 6% transactions.
Perfect, thanks, Alan. Leon was asking, are customs duty VAT rates more favorable for e-commerce than traditional trade? I think Alan mentioned this a little bit earlier on how it differs from e-commerce. It is a different system compared to traditional trade.
It is.
And if you want more details on that, guys, feel free to reach out to Alan and to Kevin in relation to that.
Yeah, we've got some
ahead,
specific information related to cross-border e-commerce, which we can share with anybody who's interested.
Right. Then David had a question. Does Alanders have a business model whereby they can consolidate a group of small brands, whether they are in the UK, US, or Europe, and can organize the shipment into a free trade zone in China, ready and available for cross-border e-commerce selling?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're actively involved with many brands. I'm working on a project with the Department for International Trade here in the UK for various multiple producers, up to 50 different producers, where we'll be consolidating their products and then arranging shipping to China to be sold in a cross-border environment out of our free trade zone warehouse. So that's a great question, and yes, that can be done.
David was asking regarding to fees. I don't like sharing fees on the webinars. So David, I'm going to give you the contact details of Kevin so that you can reach out to him directly. And David just wanted to add in that these brands would be food and beverage brands.
Yeah, and that's the project we're working on with the Department for International Trade in the UK.
Okay, I think that's it. So Martin came back to us regarding his question. I think Martin's question is, if you have an entity in China that has the import and export rights, can your own entity handle the customs clearance procedures themselves?
Absolutely. Usually the company who has an import, we call it the import-export trading license. So this is something that usually if you're under a trading license criteria, usually you will have either a ground team that it's within the customs department, or you can even outsource to do the custom declaration work. It totally depends on what's your strategy. And usually a trading license is very capable of doing the custom declarations within the company itself.
Okay, then there's two last questions that I just want to hit on. One is in relation to the topic that we had on Monday in relation to IP, where I was actually providing a case study of a client whose goods got stuck in customs because a supplier of theirs had registered their trademark and had registered the trademark also at the Customs Bureau. So one of the questions that came up on Monday's session and has come up again today is, how does that process work to register your trademark at the Customs Bureaus?
So there is under the China Customs website, there is a guideline to register the trademark for any overseas brand customers, and there are step-by-steps inside the information. And also, I'm not going to go to details, but usually it's very simple. If you require the steps to register, Kevin and myself, we can also share with you after the sessions. If you are reaching out to us individually, we can also share this information to Christina as well.
Perfect. Super. I think one last question. This last question is actually from my side. And you've mentioned the HS code numerous times throughout the presentation, Alan. And I've had clients who have gone into, maybe fighting wars is an exaggeration, but let's say debates with the Customs Bureau about the definition of the HS code for their specific products. And there's differences in opinion on what it should be, which obviously then affects the customs duty rate. So when you get into situations like that, how does it get resolved?
So first of all, we have in the same case before, and how we dealt with this, usually we are going to show the customs all the documentations that we have been doing any import-export in the past. And the documentation will include the previous HS code that we have been using in the past, whether it's by the manufacturer or whether it's by the trading company or any other service provider. So once we show the customs the documentations, it is a valid proof that we can prove that to the customs that we have been using this in the past, and the customs will need to give you the green light to use that moving forward. And if they're not giving any green light to let you use the moving forward, I would recommend to reach out to the customs, they so-called the third-party custom broker, because they are the one that can do any adjustments for the HS code, and any adjustment to the HS code to a better VAT rate that you're paying, or even to a suitable HS code and the rate that you're paying.
All right. Well, I think we've gone through everything.
Yep.
So Alan, Kevin, thank you so much for joining today. Again, if people have questions in relation to customs procedures, feel free to reach out to Alan or Kevin directly. People will be getting a copy of the presentation and a copy of the recording as well. I want to thank you, both of you, for joining us. For me, it was one of the most simplified presentations I've seen in a really long time about how customs works. I found it really valuable myself, because it can get quite complicated depending on the trade structures and transactions that you do. So I appreciate that from my side. If you guys want to set up a call or a meeting with Alan or Kevin, reach out to them per email. I'm going to put it into the email tonight as well with the recording and the PowerPoint. They're going to be in CC, so you'll have the ability to just email them directly if you want to set up an appointment or a call. You can also set up a meeting with me. There's no problems with that. And last but not least, don't forget to join tomorrow's session on warehousing options, because it really follows on so nicely with today's presentation related to customs clearances, because your products have to end up somewhere. And I've had a lot of stories that I can also share in regards to terrible warehousing facilities, but also people bringing their products to the wrong areas, whether bonded or non-bonded. So it's really critical for you all to understand what that means in relation to China. So if you haven't signed up, go to woodburnglobal.com/events and you can register there. Kevin won't be joining us tomorrow, but Alan will be presenting. So Kevin, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. Greatly appreciated. And Alan, we will see you tomorrow.
Yes,
perfect. Thanks, Christina.
Thank you, Christina.
Thanks, Alan.
Great. Take care.
Thanks, Kevin.
Bye.
Guys, bye.
Take care, buddy. Take care, guys. Okay, bye-bye.